Good morning, welcome back to another We Are Sunday Morning briefing in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. Again, before we get stuck into things, if you haven't yet, make sure you head over to We Are Sunderland and subscribe. It's just £1 for 6 months of coverage, £2.99 per month after that. If you subscribe at the minute, you could be in with a chance of winning season tickets for next year in the Black Cats bar. So there's a pair of season tickets worth, I think it's over 1.6k combined the prize is worth. So it's well worth entering just for £1. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll get stuck into things. Joe, how are you doing?
Yeah, not bad. We're almost there. The finish line's almost in sight. 8 days to go.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? It's something that Mike Dodds was asked about yesterday, and it's something that I found quite interesting. Is about something that's gone up obviously on We Are Sunderland this morning about the style of play. And I'm keen to pick his brains a little bit more on that, maybe at next week's press conference, about how difficult it actually has been for him to sort of implement a style of play, because he spoke about Sunderland being stodgy, and I think there's very little room to argue, isn't there? I think that's what every Sunderland fan, I mean, even in the press box, we've sat down there, you watch the game, there's no flow, there's no impetus. If there is, or if there has been, it's been for maybe 10, 15 minutes of a game, a half at most. It hasn't been consistent at all, has it?
No, it hasn't. I think if you look across Mike Dodds' 11 games, you tell me which one is the standout. I think possibly Leicester, second half against Leicester, they put them on the back foot a little bit.
But even then they got beat. Yeah.
Like even then they still didn't get the goal and the result. And I suppose even then as well, did you ever truly believe that there was enough conviction in there that they would? Yeah. Or was it a case of you just thinking Leicester sort of have this game, they stood on control of the game? It's been really difficult. I think his first game against Swansea, where he tweaked things too much, really. We spoke about that, didn't we? Did he overcomplicate it? I think he pretty much conceded that he did as well, certainly that first half, in an attempt to try and do that. And then obviously the injuries and the way that it's gone, the run of defeats, and then even after the Cardiff game, I should come in and say actually the Cardiff game is the best one, really, isn't it, in terms of the performance? After that, you're thinking, okay, can they kick on? And then they get hit with 5 by Blackburn. So yeah, it's been really, really difficult to put a stamp on it, put an imprint on it. But that's not just a Mike Dodds thing. If you look at Michael Beale's tenure, the performance has dropped off under him, just possibly the way he set them up and, sorting up pressure and being a bit more narrow. But even Mowbray in the first half of the season wasn't getting the same kind of tune that he was last year. It was a lot. It felt, I'm not sure what the right word is here, but it just felt as though something was missing. And I'm not just talking about putting the ball in the back net, that end product. It just didn't feel as though it was as quick and as was threatening as what we'd seen, outside of going to Jack Clark and hoping he can do something individually. So it's been a problem for whoever's been stood in the dugout. I think it's been heightened a little bit recently because Dodds has flipped back to, some people will say negative tactics, but, certainly to sort of stifle 2 teams in Leeds and West Brom. And then was he almost forced into keeping that shape against Millwall with the injuries to Neil and the illness to Hume, possibly. But even when he shifted that in the second half, it still didn't come to anything, did it? So it's just the way that it's been all season. This season, whoever's been stood in the dugout, which then you go back to the sort of the squad and the recruitment and things like that.
I don't know about you, but I think what's been the most disappointing for me, and not just with Mike Dodds' tenure, but I think even in Michael Beale's, is when changes have been made, they talk about the need to tweak things. We haven't really seen, what these are. The club and the squad anyway just seems to have gone backwards dramatically. I mean, we share the XG graphs a lot about where they were. Now, I just think now we're obviously approaching the end of the season and, the club's so data-driven now. It's absolutely staggering now, even still looking back at that decision, because you look at where Sunderland were in terms of XG. It's the highest they've been, and yes, it's a 5-game rolling. It's a 5-game rolling trends line. But even the XG was so far above expected goals against. Now, again, some people will be like, oh, well, what does that even mean? It's not a great metric to measure off. But actually, it is really interesting because it's how many efforts Sunderland are having in dangerous areas of the pitch. And it's almost disappeared completely. And I think what's most concerning is, nobody knows, or at least we haven't seen yet this season, how to address that and how to get back to that, and it's hugely concerning.
No, you're absolutely right, and it is a worthwhile metric. I totally get the frustration sometimes, all these data and all these stats and things like that. But clubs are doing that.
Yeah, it's the way the game's going, isn't it?
It's an anomaly if a club isn't doing that. And I'm not just talking about in the Premier League and the Championship. That goes right the way down the pyramid. Yeah. So if clubs are doing that, it's absolutely justified in looking into some of this data. And XG is absolutely one of them, where even if it's just a case of how threatening are Sunderland, how often are they creating? And like you say, that them trend lines, the way that they dropped off under Beale was so alarming. But you could see it as well. I always like to try and match things up with are they what you're seeing as well? Because sometimes the stats can dig out something else, but you were watching that under Michael Beale and it wasn't threatening. It was a completely different sort of style of football than what we'd seen from Sunderland over the last 12 months. I mean, if you look in the second half of the season, or pretty much since Mowbray left, in terms of that XG, the amount of times that they've gone below 1, I think it was only under 1 twice under Mowbray this season. And it's been multiple times, over 10 times since he's left, which tells its own story. They're not creating enough chances. Now, I thought it was interesting as well, this can bring it back to Mike Dodds' press conference yesterday, how is that a age thing? He was asked, is that down to being a young squad and perhaps not wanting to take risks on the ball, in fear of giving it away when you're in a bit of a rut? And he sort of combated that and said, no, it's not an age thing. He used Chris Rigg as a perfect example. And then almost questioned players' mentality, which I thought was really, really interesting, because it's not something that he's tended to do. I remember a quote a couple of weeks ago, he sort of said, I'll throw myself under the bus before them. Now, I'm not saying that quote is throwing his team under the bus there, but it is sort of the last sort of week or two, we've seen the first few question marks from Dodds of the players. We called them boring last week, questioned the mentality a little bit there this week. It just sort of shows that, is the squad up to the level that it needs to be? Well, obviously the league table and things like these XG metrics and what we're seeing with the eye test says that it's not.
I mean, he doubled down on that boring claim as well, multiple times in the recent press conference. And I know he came under flack for that. But I also think, on the flip side, if he hadn't come out and said that, and if he came out and tried to pander to positives, then, supporters would have given him flack on that front. But I understand, because I've said it myself, if you're coming out as a head coach and saying that that's boring, then you're sort of leaving yourself open a bit there, aren't you? I think, just on the press conference, there was a number of interesting things, and I think you've mentioned that the key one is the mentality side of things. Now, again, we talk about what we see with the eye when you sat there watching it, and that has been probably the most frustrating part. I think no matter what shape you play, it's just they don't play through the lines enough. They don't. I think we called for Adil Aushish to come in and play, and he finds pockets of space really well. And earlier this year we said he's the ideal man to fill sort of an Alex Pritchard type role, and that was something Pritch did really well, isn't it? Is sit in the pockets of space, operate in dangerous areas, and we don't have that. And I think again, you can make what you will of shape, but there seems to me, and there has been all season, I think, no matter what sort of shape you play, there's been a disconnect, I think, hasn't there, between whoever's played up front and just anywhere. Just they don't play through central areas of the pitch.
Yeah. It
tends to be out wide, and I completely get that, because that's where your strength is in Jack Clark on that left-hand side. But you also need more. And I think, Mike Dodds has spoken about Patrick Roberts on the right-hand side. There hasn't been the little, fluidity. You asked about, Dan Neil playing further forward. Nobody seems to be able to put the finger on why that is, why there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, it's a totally valid point, and it's one we could probably talk about for hours, but you're absolutely right in what you're saying. It's almost a bit of a surprise when you see that ball threaded through. I remember last week there was one that went into Styles. He drifted in from that wing-back role, and I think it was Bellingham had dropped a little bit deeper, and rather than go up with Clark, he took one inside the Styles, and that was when he tried to link up with Pembele, and you're thinking, oh, wow, like, finally, something. But that was it. That was pretty much the only time, and that is sort of every week. You mentioned Aushish in there. He does pick up some decent spots. QPI, he got a little bit of freedom in that, but there was nothing else to it.
Yeah.
And I think probably shows again how important that striker is and how much a team can become disjointed if you don't have that focal point in the centre of the field, because you then almost, to go back to that mentality comment, you are they questioning whether they trust going through the central areas, going through the lines like you mentioned, into a forward area to a Rusin or a Hamir, whoever's up there, in fear that it's going to stick, or if there's going to be somebody there around where it's just going to turn over straight away. Are they better off being a bit more conservative, going out wide to Clark, going out wide to Roberts or Rigg, whoever's out there? And that is the way that it's gone this season. Problem is, with it only being Clark, certainly until Riggs come in the second half of the season, he's getting doubled up on, tripled up on sometimes, and you're just getting stifled unless he can do something, out of the ordinary, which sometimes he has been able to do this season. And it just, for me, it totally emphasises that need of a striker, not just to put the ball in the net, to be that sort of presence up front. We spoke about that with Hamir. He sort of has the attributes you'd think to do that, but the mentality, like what Todd said, clearly isn't there just yet, as he's changing cultures and things like that. And the other players, that are they too lightweight? Are they the type of player who can do that? Do they need someone else to bounce off? All these different dynamics that the club have to try and find a solution to over the summer, because, like I say, you need to be able to think outside the box sometimes, because if it is just going out wide to Clark or wide to Roberts, teams can suss that straight away. You need to have different elements to how you approach things. Last year, if you think of that front four, when the few times that they did play together, I know the injuries impacted things. You could either go through the middle of Stewart with Ahmad, or you could go out wide to Clark, you go out wide to Roberts. There's threats everywhere across that front four. You can stretch the play. Now it doesn't feel like there is. Even though you might get Job when he's up front, he'll chase down and he'll harry the defenders and things like that, and he'll put a shift in. But is it going up there and sticking to the point where you think he can do something, or are there enough players around him to do something? Absolutely not. There isn't.
I mean, again, that's not a slight on Job. That's just
it's not,
the reality of the situation where we are. I mean, just on Job, we seem to have this conversation like it's been a theme, hasn't it, throughout the season, of being consistent with a striker. Job ended up that was tinkering that I felt was a change that maybe didn't need to happen against Millwall. Dak starting, it just raised sort of more questions, didn't it? I mean, I would have stuck with Job up top and potentially given Styles an opportunity with something we'll get on to. But I'm just struggling heading into these final two games of what are we going to see here? I mean, what should we expect? Anything? I mean, there's players effectively playing for the future, like not in terms of contractual wise, but I think I was listening to the Wise Men saying, and Rich, and I think it was Matty who on there, that they said, that these young lads who they brought in up front, and it's a point I agree with. They brought players in who, it's all fair and well saying, they're going to be good in 2 and 3 years' time, but Sunderland need players to be good in the here and now. And at some point, look, there's a realization, or there will have to be at some point, that some of the ones who they've brought in on judgment right here, right now, are not good enough. So that's something else that they're going to have to consider in the summer. Do they cut the losses a bit like they did with Lahaji last year? It's a massive sort of summer, isn't it?
That's a really good point, actually, on him, because he was brought in possibly as a replacement, for Ahmad this season. Obviously, the fee that they got believed to be decent, which is why the offer went, but never really got a chance to see enough of him, barring a few cameos, did we? And then he was on his way. And I totally agree with you. They can't think that having a player who might be good 6, 12, 18 months down the line is here for here and now. Otherwise, we've seen the sort of regression that's happened this season, where there's been sort of no leadership, really. We use that word so many times, but that is what it has felt like. You need somebody to come in who's ready now, and that is, it's just so evident. Because, I mean, even there's players there now. You think of an Abdullah Bar, for example. He's coming into what next season will be his 3rd season with the club. He's one who really has to take initiative next season and sort of make a spot of his own, and not to the point where he's drifting in and out of the team. And, the other week where he was even out of the squad, is that a mentality thing? There's so many different factors here, and there's some players who we spoke about injuries or lack of form this year, the likes of Roberts, for example, or Alesi, needing good pre-season. Somebody like a Bar as well, for me, needs a really good pre-season to sort of show that this model or the way that they bring players in like that is going to work. otherwise, you have to go back to the drawing board and think about the sort of players that you're bringing in again.
Yeah, just a quick plug. If you haven't seen, earlier on this week, we did a sit down with Sam over the WD, I think it was 18, was it, podcast? I forget the numbers on the end of it now. My brain, like a sieve. But yeah, we did a good sit down with him, give us a really good insight into Watford. Now, Tom Cleverley has obviously since been appointed there. It feels like one of those games for Sunderland. I don't think Watford have won since early November. But, like at home, I think in particular, Sunderland's away form's actually improved in recent weeks.
Yeah.
So, again, it's the first time I think I've sat there all this season and we're heading into a game and I'm not really sure what is going to happen from either side, because they're both safe. It's effectively a dead rubber. And again, like we've spoken about experimentation, and we're approaching the end of the season, and these are the two games where I think, as I've said, I did a piece earlier this week about Callum Styles, and it's interesting. Now, I'm not saying there was comments online, and it was an interesting debate off the back of it about should Chris Rigg be playing in there instead of Callum Styles in a central midfield role. But I think if you want to have a serious conversation about bringing in. You've got a player there ready. You've seen him for months. Give him an opportunity in that. Otherwise, I think it's then a missed opportunity. I don't know what you think. I don't know whether you think Rigg should be in there. It's an interesting debate, isn't it?
The Rigg one's interesting. I think we spoke about it, I think with Scott when he was on the pod last week. I think, and Mike Dodds has said it, down the line, Rigg's going to move into central midfield.
Yeah.
I think we asked the question on that show, do you see Chris Rigg as being Dan Neil's replacement? And you can see that. For me, I think you can absolutely see that, the attributes that he has now, once he gets a little bit more experience and, maybe he's physically grows out a bit or fills out a little bit more as well, you can absolutely see him sort of flourishing in that central midfield role. I think with Styles, if you're serious about turning that loan deal into a permanent one, you've got to give him a shot in there from the start. Not just move him in and rotate him in as the games change. If you're wanting to try and get back into a game or whatever, give him a start in there, these two games, so you can build up a little bit more evidence on what you think of him and then make your assessment there. Because if you're just basing it off the wing-back situation, we spoke about it before, once these players are fit in terms of Cirkin and Lacey up to speed next season, Huggins thereafter, Styles isn't. Likewise, he held that those two players, they're not your starting wing backs or left backs. They're not. They're quite a way down that pecking order. So Styles needs to move into that sixth role as he does for his national team. As he said himself, he wants to have the conversation about. Now, he hadn't had it up until yesterday, did he?
Yeah.
Whether that's something that's going to happen between now and kick-off or when team news lands on Saturday, we'll soon see. But for me, I agree. I think if you're going to sign him, or if you're serious about signing him, it's at least worth giving him a look from the start in that centre midfield role in a game that is a dead rubber, particularly if you're going to keep Rigg out on the right, for the reasons that have been mentioned in terms of his development before. Yeah,
it's something that I asked Mike Dodds, isn't it, about, like, is it something you've considered? Now, I think, interestingly, with Sunderland going to back three, back five, they've played, a variation of a 3-4-3, which isn't too dissimilar to what Hungary actually operate with, having looked at them, some of their previous games. They don't really operate with wingers. They're two wide men or more, number 10. So Dominic Szoboszlai, who's obviously at Liverpool, plays in front of Styles. But it's interesting that it's shape-wise, it's not too dissimilar. But they play with 2 6s, where I think Sunderland's tended to play with, a 6 and an 8, or someone a bit more box to box. But it's certainly worth, like you say, I think it would be a missed opportunity if they didn't at least give him a go in that holding midfield role.
I think as well, the nail injury is quite important, because it's a significant injury. There's a little bit of caution over whether he's going to be fit for pre-season. Yeah. So it's clearly quite a substantial injury that he's picked up, the ankle injury. And if he's not fit to go for pre-season, then you are going to need somebody. You're going to need 2 midfielders, because they still need that, like we've spoken about so many times, that number 6, that physical presence anyway. But if Neil's going to miss a pre-season, how many times have we seen players in the past where, and even hearing players when you interview them, you don't get a pre-season under your belt. It becomes really difficult to catch up to get that match fitness and that sharpness. Pre-season is massive for players, but whether supporters and us as reporters like going through the motions and things like that for the games. It's hugely important for the players, and if he's not going to be ready for the full pre-season, that is another aspect to it. And certainly in terms with Styles as well, do you keep him in to start the season in that role, or is Chris Rigg going to then come in and start in that role? Certainly open for debate.
Yeah, I mean, something else that's open for debate is obviously Elliot Elliots and Jay Matte's future. Now, they're both injured, both expected to sort of return for pre-season. Now, when Sunderland got promoted, I really wanted to see Elliot Elliots obviously given a run and play in midfield, because I think even the year before when he was at Blackpool, he was instrumental in their promotion, and I know they wanted to take him, make the move a permanent one. Sunderland obviously kept him. Injuries just for the pair of them haven't gone their way. They've just sort of, both of them in recent years, that time on Wayside's been plagued by it. And I think even, Jay Matty last year when he came up with was Plymouth, they were raving about him down there. And, you're left with question marks now. Is League One their level? Can they make the step up? Because it's been such a long time now where neither of them have had consistent game time. And we've spoken about obviously keeping a hold of players, but there are players on the fringes of the squad who, you might have to potentially trim if you want to, bring in the quality players that you need. And it would be unfortunate in someone's case like Elliot Elliots having come through the academy, but we just haven't quite seen enough of him on the pitch. It's the sad sort of reality of his career in recent years.
Yeah, it is. It's really unfortunate for Elliots because obviously he played a role in the final in getting Sunderland open. Again, it's another one we've spoken about a little bit before in terms of positionally for him. I think that is one thing that is a little bit of an issue for Elliots, where in that sort of midfield, if you put a box in midfield of sort of from your 6 to your 8 to your 10s, you probably play in all of them. You can probably play in the wide areas as well. Which one are you nailing down and saying he's going to start there, or which shirt are you going to take when you've got a full strength side? It's a difficult one, and particularly like you say, given the amount of time that he's had out, are they going to come back the same player? He hasn't had a run in the Championship enough to prove whether he is at this level, like you said as well.
Yeah.
Matete, he was another one so unfortunate because he was one I was quite excited to see in pre-season last year. Went over to America, started quite well first couple of games, then obviously picked up the injury and then hasn't been seen since. He's another one where he's just not had there was a lot of sort of hope about him coming in Fleetwood in terms of the model.
Yeah,
that'd be the kind of right sort of thing to do. Bring a player like that in who's doing well somewhere else, albeit at a lower level. I know some of them were coming out of the division at that time, but again, just if you're not getting that game time, it's difficult. The one thing that Matete is going in his favour is that area of the pitch where he is situated at is wide open. Sunderland need somebody in there. Neil and Ecker have had to do the full season basically in there. We're just talking there about Dan Neil's injury. If he's going to miss the pre-season, you're another man down in there. That midfield, that central midfield, or that number 6 area is desperately light at the moment, particularly if you're not going to keep Corey Evans on. Something else that we don't know yet. Nice to see him come back on last week, but 2 games to go, big decision on his future. That area of the pitch is so sparse at the moment, which helps Matete's cause probably more than Elliots at the moment. I
mean, then you've got to throw in, a potential new manager coming in.
Absolutely.
Will he have previous with any of the players? Will he? What shape does he want to play? I found it interesting the fact that Mike Dodds referenced that, just with going to a back 3. I mean, you can read into that whatever you will, but I think it's certainly a talking point, isn't it? Regardless of especially at home when Sunderland are against Millwall, they changed it. They went away from that back 3, back 5 to get more runners in behind. It didn't work. So again, that sort of goes back to what we were talking about at the start, where it's just that final third of the pitch. I think you're right. And again, nobody's been able to put their finger on it. But why? It just has not clicked in that area. And as you say, is it experience? I certainly think like a focal point and just having somebody to play off has been massive. So, Ross Stewart for me was the striker that was, I think Sunderland were actually built to Ross Stewart to suit his style of play, running in behind, target, like big target man. Ellis Sims was a bit less, he wasn't as much of a runner in behind, but he's still a big physical focal point that you can play off. Now, you're right in saying that Hamir has, the frame to do so, and I completely agree. But that they need somebody of that mould, I think, a willing runner in behind. But the problem again is how many clubs are looking for that, because there's so many clubs now play high press, trying to put clubs on, other teams on the back foot. And I think there has been a realization that they need to address, bring in more senior players, more experienced players this summer. So again, it's where are we? Like,
I mean, you mentioned Ella Sims there, just classic example.
Yeah.
Some people perhaps Sunderland obviously didn't want to stump up the fee for him. What Coventry paid. I know they've got a windfall from the Gyökeres sale.
Yeah.
What was it? He scored in the semi-final last week. What was that? 19 goals this season.
Something like that. Yeah.
Put that in Sunderland's team. Completely different outlook, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I know it's easy and it could be perceived lazy to say something like that, but it's staring you right in the face. And Sunderland had him in the building, and I know it's difficult because he went back on loan, but
yeah,
the option was certainly there. And you would like to think, given how he did well here, if Sunderland were in for him, if the offer was accepted, if they put an offer that was accepted, you probably would have come here over Coventry. So, again, it just goes back to, but is that a funds thing? Is that a philosophy or a recruitment thing? Who knows? But it's just, again, and you can go through a number of players who sort of got away from them as such. We spoke about Kiefer Moore in the January window, for example, but there's players there that would make a huge difference, or would have made a huge difference this season than what we've seen. Mm. And the thing is, if Clark's going to go in the summer as well, this could end up being a real sort of transition summer across the squad. So what we're seeing now, or what we've seen in the second half of this season, it could be completely different from who's starting in August.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that I think is a concern, because we've spoke about, the model in theory is about bringing players in and generally, having a plan or having players already in the building for next season. I think if we talk about the Clark scenario in particular, and again, I understand the comments of, Jack Clark wasn't the Jack Clark that we're seeing now when they signed him. I get that. The problem is when Jack Clark is your talisman, you then need to replace somebody who's producing Jack Clark's numbers here and now. Because you think about it, and I know this might be seen as a lazy comparison, if you take Jack Clark out the side, where would Sunderland be? That's all hypothetical, but that is, we'll widely expect that to be the case next year. Jack Clark isn't going to be a Sunderland player, as I think that's a fair comment, given how well he's played this year. So where does the replacement come from? Or do they go out and buy? Do they see what they have in the building as being ready? Romain Mundle was somebody who was brought in, and we said, look, could that be the case? He's been on the fringes of things, hasn't he?
Yeah, he's. I mean, outside of the first couple of weeks, his involvement's been very limited, hasn't it? Really, even in terms of 21s, he hasn't necessarily dropped down into there. What we've seen with some players, so it's quite, or it's going to be quite interesting to see the way that they go about it with him. Is it going to be a case of he needs a little bit more development time at the beginning of next season? Mm-hmm. Or is he one that they're going to be counting on to come straight in? And then that goes back to then why are you bringing a player in like that with nobody else in January, given what was needed in January? And it's the same with Hjelde and Styles in terms of the January window. I mean, Styles has been the most efficient in terms of output on the field, but it just wasn't what Sunderland needed. Like you said it a few minutes ago, the here and now is what Sunderland need. If you wanted to kick on and get to that next step, the perfect platform was last summer. There was a feel-good factor. There's not often you get a feel-good factor around a place after you've just lost a playoff semi-final.
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, fans will go away, really disappointed and, crestfallen. Wasn't like that. Yeah, initially after the defeat, because it obviously always difficult, but there was a real optimism. There was a real feeling of this could be a springboard to go and compete next season. And they missed that massively in the summer with the way that the recruitment went, and then did it again in January. That's why we've spoken about ad nauseum. Boy, it's such an important summer across the board, getting the head coach right and getting the recruitment right. Key areas for every club, of course, but I know 12 months on, we'll probably be saying the same thing. 12 months ago, we'll probably be saying the same thing, but it just feels so important this time.
Just
before you do go, actually, you mentioned sort of key players leaving. It's quite ironic in terms of the Watford game this weekend.
Yeah.
In terms of how they did it, we spoke with Sam, didn't we? They lost Sarr, Pedro, players like that. They did it, and he was quite content with the squad at least, and then looking to do that this season, that springboard this season that I've just been speaking about there. Sunderland are almost in a similar boat as to what Watford have done over the last 12 months. Rather, they're trying to stop that cycle of head coach routinely changing, and they sold their key players and reinvested around the squad with a few more experienced heads. I think you mentioned Jake Livermore, for example. He seemed quite upbeat for a team that, if you compare how the feelings of what Sam was coming across with to what the mood is around the stadium are like, considering where the two teams are in the division, was very much different, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I do think that that's an interesting point as well. That was what I was going to sort of round things off on, is there's a lot of clubs trying to do the same sort of thing. I think Borough are a pretty good comparison for Sunderland, because both lost key players, but I think it was widely accepted, at least from most people at Borough, that when you lose a player of like Chuba Akpom, they lost Ryan Giles, who returned on loan, that it was a bit of a transitional season for them. I think it was accepted here at Sunderland. I think the only disappointment and the difference to maybe, Watford and Borough, I think Borough sort of started the season poorly and they're starting to really sort of find their groove and they're pushing on up there now. Sunderland started the season really well, like we've said, just outside the playoffs. Even, I think, was it late February, they were still, 6 points off, something like that. That's been the difference for me. Is it a sign of, that these players, well, obviously they can do it. They've shown they can do it. They've shown that they can churn out results and get up there. Can they, so what, this is what I mean. It's just, how's the drop?
I think the managerial changes have impacted things, of course, and Dodds kind of referenced that in his press conference. That is upsetting for a team who was so on board with Tony Mowbray, for that to change, and then you bring someone else in with new ideas. He only lasts 12 games, changes again. Whatever you think of footballers or in that situation, they're human beings. If you have that sort of much change in a short period of time in your workplace, it probably is difficult. Now I know, look, paid handsomely and things like that. You got to get on with the job on the pitch, blah blah blah, that sort of thing. But it's got to make an impact. It has to, no doubt about it. Getting all these different ideas and seeing these change of people that you might or might not want to have come and gone. So that has played an impact, no doubt about it. But equally, across the board, everyone needs to have been better than what has been, certainly since December.
I think Mike Dodds' comments as well were interesting the other week as well, just sort of referencing when he took over from Tony Mowbray, there wasn't much change. When he took over from Michael Beale, there was a lot of change, which somewhat contradicts, Christian Speakman's comments when they arrived. It was sort of portrayed as it's not going to be that much of a change. Michael Beale said, look, I'm just going to tweak things. Does the blame lie with Michael Beale? Is it something that, Christian Speakman said he foreshadowed, a drop off? The stats or the data was pointing towards a drop off. Now, I think you can see that wasn't sustainable where they were at, because it's been the highest XG, trend in XG that they've had all season. But I think the gravity and the size of the drop off is the most alarming thing. I don't think anybody would have, envisaged quite how serious this drop off was. And as we've said, numerous times, we're obviously going over all ground here, but with 2 games left and not a lot to play for, it's understandable why we're doing so. But it's the lack of a reaction, the lack of a managerial bounce. And I think heading into the Watford game, sort of to bring it full circle, they need, I'm going to be honest, they need 2 wins from these final 2 games. Whether that'll happen, it remains to be seen, but the need to finish on a positive footing. There needs to be some feel good around the place, especially for when players just come back from pre-season. You don't want to be like, oh, here we go again. Getting the right man in at the helm will also dictate a lot of that. It'll be right, here we go. What's the message going to be this summer? What players are coming in? Do they realistically think that the playoffs are a realistic aim, as they've said throughout the entire campaign? So many questions, and it all starts at Vicarage Road, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point. Just to quickly go what you said first there about the alignment is the word that they quite like to use, in terms of having Speakman in that spot and direct role. You then have your manager or your head coach and then your team, so you can just take their head coach out and everything sort of still functions the way that it would anyway. So for there to be that sort of recognised change, it does open a few questions up. But yeah, with Watford, I think we've done quite a good job there of skirting around what feels like it'll be. I think he was asked if it would be a war of attrition on Saturday, and it's hard to think otherwise, wouldn't it? I think Watford have drawn or not scored in 3 of the last 4. Sunderland's goal record, like we saying there with the XG and things like that dropping off, it points towards it not being the most entertaining of afternoons. He says, waiting for a 4-4 draw on Saturday afternoon. But, I agree. Just something to clean. I mean, it's the last away game of the season. Supporters will go down there and enjoy themselves either way. But the away form has picked up since the international break. That is one thing.
Yeah.
So we can take that into next week against Sheffield Wednesday, where that could be a different atmosphere for different reasons, given what could be at stake for Sheffield Wednesday. But yeah, we've said it so many times again, just positivity. I mean, you think of what the feeling was, the mood just coming out of that ground last weekend against Millwall. It was just nothing, and that's almost worse than anger. The apathy is almost worse than the anger and the frustration, and that is where we're at. We're entrenched in apathy at the moment. Even if whatever the result is, I don't think that changes. But at least, you say, it gives the players something to G them up going into next week, and then possibly into the summer as well, in pre-season and things like that.
Yeah, I think obviously this will be the final point now, but I think the biggest thing for me this summer, and I don't know about you, but it has to be about building bridges and getting a rapport back with the fan base, because as you've said there, apathy setting in, it's a dangerous place to be. I think Rich's piece from earlier this week sort of looked back in 2005 and when Sunderland won promotion, it wasn't a packed out stadium of they can't afford for that to settle in again. Like we've said so many times, it's, yes, look, the signs of investment in the stadium of positive. It's the playing squad now. All eyes are on the playing squad, because that's what's going to get you promotion at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a wave of momentum around the club for 18 months since the promotion.
Yeah.
Season ticket sales last season are the biggest indicator of that. What was it, 34,000 season ticket sales? I suspect that number will drop this summer, and that's indicative of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 months at the club, on and off the field. So you're absolutely right to say that they've got to start building those bridges back. I mean, obviously the Mowbray decision started it, then they had the Beale appointment, the Newcastle farce, all of those rolled into the same month. Supporters took hit after hit, and then the form dropped off completely, and then the transfer window and things like that. So yeah, there's quite a lot of water under the bridge there to try and make amends. But I mean, the time off will help that. Whenever a new season comes, everyone has that sort of renewed optimism at a new season. But again, the head coach and the recruitment are things that are absolutely, they're the first steps to getting people on board with that, and it's something that they've got to get right.
Yeah, definitely. We'll draw things to a close there. Again, we've been in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. It's just £1 to subscribe to We Are Sunderland over on our website. And if you do so, you could be in with a chance of winning a pair of season tickets for next year in the Black Cats Bar. So it's a mega prize. If you haven't yet, head over there, take advantage of it. It's a great little offer that we've got going on at the minute. Thanks again for joining us this morning. I'll be at Vicarage Road, the long drive down there tomorrow, and I will see you all there. Hopefully, it's a 4-4, Joe, like you mentioned.